waiting around. People will show up late. Yeah.
All right. You're now listening to the RSU lecture series, What is Communism?, hosted by the one and only Weatherly.
Welcome, everybody. I'm glad that those of you that came made it out. So before we start, I have a couple of disclaimers. I have 3 disclaimers that I'd like to mention. So even on an introductory level, communism is obviously a super complex, super in-depth topic. And so a lot of stuff that I wish I had time to go over, I don't have time to go over. It's by no means comprehensive. And another part of that is I don't even have time to articulate some of the arguments I have against the arguments I'll be making. I think that there will definitely, I think it's important to understand kind of like bread and butter Marx communism stuff in order to be able to critique it. And so some of the critiques I think are necessary to make, I actually won't be able to make. One of the things that I can't really give much of an overview over is the difference between socialism and communism. Just I wanted to name that at the beginning. Whether socialism is like a transitionary phase of communism or the emergent phase of communism itself, it's a super complex question that could take up the entire hour if I were to get into it too much. So I just wanted to clear the air on that first. We're talking about capitalism, and then we're going to talk about communism. The transition process between those two things will be touched on, but not nearly as much as it deserves. And then the last thing is just a language and accessibility point. Is I'd ask that everybody holds questions about like comments they have or critiques they want to make about concepts themselves. But if anybody doesn't understand the language I use or wants me to better explain something, then questions throughout are good for that kind of thing. All right, so I have a little kind of thesis blurb I'd like to do before I really get into it. So it's my experience that very few people, even among self-described communists themselves, understand just how radical communism is for the present world. It's not simply a reorganization of how our economy is managed, it's in some senses the abolition of the economy itself. I would go so far to argue that the communization of the earth would be an event and process which has no historical parallel in terms of magnitude and significance. Put differently, the beginning of the histories of human society, since the beginning of agriculture, might even be considered less important than the establishment of communism should such happen. So the following lecture probably won't be able to fully explain or justify this really bold claim, but I think I'd like to at least try to do part of it. Okay. So it's best to understand communism in basically 2 ways. So the first one is a society which is classless and thus stateless, moneyless, workless, borderless, prisonless, policeless, at all. Many other things. Some might also say genderless and raceless. We'll talk a little bit about that later. It's kind of a contested thing. But notice specifically that it's thus stateless. Oftentimes I see communism described as classless and stateless and moneyless, which kind of separates all of these terms and imagines that something can be stateless but not classless or classless but not stateless. Communism is classless and therefore stateless, moneyless, workless, etc. These things depend on the existence of class society. The second way is the real movement. So in the German ideology, Marx and Engels describe communism not as a state of affairs which is to be established, an ideal to which reality will have to adjust itself. We call communism the real movement which abolishes the present state of things. The condition of this movement result from the premises now in existence. So this is to say that communism already exists in some form. It's something that capitalist society is, maybe to use a kind of weird word, is pregnant with. It's something that exists within the already existing social fabric of our world, and is the real movement to overcome the capitalist structure that exists on top of it. So another thing that I think most people probably know, but isn't often articulated, is that Marx did not coin the term communism or socialism. In some sense, these terms, or at least like the concepts that they're describing, have existed maybe since the beginning of human history, this kind of ideal world where we're living in common, maybe living in common again, if you want to use that kind of a lens. And so kind of contemporary with Marx, a little bit before, was these utopian socialist figures. So often these were entrepreneurs that had enough money and privilege and free time to be able to imagine a society different from the capitalist one that was emerging. This is kind of like early industrialization, transitioning out of mercantilism. And so it might have just been like thought projects, like Fourier's Imagined Society, for example. He wanted the oceans to be turned into lemonade, so obviously he didn't really do that, but he did create these kind of separated commune societies called phalansteries. And it's just this very idealistic kind of project. It's this idea that socialism can be just a society that we just simply imagine, something that maybe kind of on a surface level overcomes some of the things we can immediately point to capitalism and say that we don't like, but it doesn't really get to the heart of the issue. And it also kind of ignores the capacity for the working class to self-emancipate. It's these entrepreneurial figures coming in, many of them factory owners, and saying, oh, I'm going to change this factory, make it a workers' cooperative, I'm going to change this factory, make it into some kind of agricultural commune or something, where later on, the main thing that Marx changed was, or one of the main things Marx changed at least, was affirming the capacity for the working class to self-emancipate. Well, I'll get more into that in a minute. So also around, the early kind of proletarian struggle against capitalism, and these terms will be better defined later, I promise. The early proletarianization was accumulation by dispossession. It was basically these these farmlands held in common, cultivated by multiple families in a given area, that were literally violently enclosed by the British government. And people were forced off of their land, kind of de facto, sometimes literally forced at the end of a sword or a gun, and finding themselves no longer able to access a means of subsistence, like a family farm or a community farm or whatever it is, and left only with their labor power, only their capacity to work, and now their capacity to work has to be sold to somebody else. So the early proletariat, their struggle against capital was resisting this, actually. They imagined socialism as a workshop of the world was the term used at the time, whereas this lots of small cottage industry, petty commodity producers, kind of small-scale bartering and trading around the world, resisting this situation where everybody's just reduced to a cog in a machine in a factory or a mill or like a restaurant or a Walmart or something. So what Marx changed about this was he affirmed that capitalist development of the productive forces is what creates the possibility for socialism. It's not something that's a resistance to the development of capitalism. It's something that goes beyond the development of capitalism. And the self-emancipation of the working class, like I mentioned earlier, and also a particular attention to the ways that capitalist production is organized. The particular logics that define the way that the capitalist system operates, not simply the things that are immediately identified about what isn't like about it. So that's called the critique of political economy. Marx drew from Adam Smith, Dave Ricardo, James Mill, among others, these British bourgeois political economists is the term often used. And they had a more or less accurate understanding of the way that capitalism works. There was a few things that Marx maybe edited or changed, that just some poor data or poor analysis, but he didn't really, his project wasn't to just have a better understanding of political economy. Like the labor theory of value, for example, this is a term that a lot of people maybe have heard in association with Marx. He didn't invent this. This actually comes from Adam Smith and then Ricardo. But the main thing that he wants to do is subject political economy to something called an immanent critique, or like its concept limit. So we have, through Smith and Ricardo, pretty good understanding of the ways that capitalist production works, but what kind of opposing social forces exist within them that might create conflict or crisis. Because we know that capitalism is a historically specific mode of production. We weren't always capitalists. This is a fairly new phenomenon in human history. And so this was created out of a feudal society. And so what could come out of capitalism to create a new society? And so we have to understand in a really meticulous way the way capitalism works in order to do this. So in the first line of the first section of the first chapter of the first volume of Capital, he says that capitalist society presents itself as an immense accumulation of commodities, its unit being a single commodity. Our investigation must therefore begin with the analysis of the commodity. And so a commodity, simply put, is an object with any kind of use, whether it's something that you eat or something that you read or whatever kind of usage you might have, that's produced specifically to be exchanged. So the only way that we can say something like a shoe has an equal value to something like a lamp is if there's a third term that establishes some kind of equivalency between them. You obviously can't put on a lamp on your body or turn on and make a shoe light up. And so there has to be some kind of third thing that isn't particular to any of the physical qualities of these objects or any kind of subjective usage that they might have, which allows them to be exchanged. How can it be that a certain amount of apples can be equal to a certain amount of oranges? They're qualitatively different things. And so the way that this is established, the value of this thing is socially necessary labor time. So for example, for an apples and oranges example, if I spend 2 hours working in an apple orchard and I get 100 apples, or 2 hours working in an orange orchard and get 300 oranges, then if I could freely pick either one of these things, then 200 apples is equivalent to 300 oranges. The amount of abstract human labor needed to get a certain amount of things is what establishes the equivalency between these things. And so labor power is a peculiar commodity. It's also a commodity, though. The ability to work, which is continuously sold by proletarians, by wage laborers. So not concretely doing some kind of labor, like building a couch or working at an apple orchard or something, but just kind of the capacity to work, thought of homogeneously, so across the entire earth, all humans carrying this sort of abstract ability to work, is sold like a commodity. It is a commodity, but it has a very particular quality that no other commodities have, which we'll get to in a minute. So Marx takes this basic analysis of the commodity form, of the value form, and extrapolates this to the entire capitalist mode of production. So he starts with basic commodities. We have all of these things that we're buying and selling. If we analyze how two of them work, if we're putting them in just a relation, just two simple commodities, he takes that and he extrapolates it into money, into the way that capital accumulates, into the way that circulation and exchange works. It's really this beautiful line of thought to watch play out. That is Capital Volume 1, and then the second and third also. But just a little bit more about money and exchange and whatnot. It's kind of the most boring part, I know, but it's useful to understand, to really get what parts of capitalism communism takes away. So in the first section, the top here, if we just imagine somebody that has a commodity, let's say 5 apples, and they sell it for a certain amount of money, they can only ever buy back 5 apples. I mean, of course, there's inflation and other kinds of economic factors that might play into this, but assuming that doesn't exist, any kind of commodity you have, you can't use to make a profit with on its own. Now, you could buy, on the other hand, if you start with money, if you're on the other side of this kind of line of money for commodity, if you start from the other perspective, if you have $5 and you buy 10 apples, you could sell these 10 apples for however much you want. And so you can have a certain amount of money, buy a commodity, and then sell that commodity for more money than you started with. This seems super obvious, right? This is like, of course, you can sell things for however much you want. But how is it that you could possibly start with more money than you had if you can't do it the other way? What kind of thing has to happen in society for this surplus to even possibly exist, right? There's the thermodynamic conservation of energy and mass thing. Energy can't be created or destroyed. How is this even possible? So an expanded formula for capitalist production is this. This is in the next chapter in Capital, after the one where he talks about that. So if you have a certain amount of starting money, you purchase a commodity, it goes through a process of production, and then you have a commodity that can be sold for more money. Something has been added to it through production, and then you have more money than you started with, and then the cycle repeats. So this production is the consumption of labor power, and this is why labor power is a peculiar commodity unlike any other one. If you're consuming an apple, that energy is just directly for your own personal needs. There isn't any kind of extra thing created with that. It's spending the energy in the apple. When the energy and labor power is spent, if you sell this labor power to a capitalist, and now they have it and they're spending it throughout the production process, that creates surplus value. If you're at an apple orchard, you have all these apples in the trees, and it costs a certain amount of money to be growing the apples and maintaining the land and whatnot. The labor that goes into picking the apples and making them ready for distribution adds something to their value, is the theory anyway. And of course, there still is kind of a problem with this of, even if it's the sale and consumption of labor power that creates the surplus, where does the energy that makes that possible come from? And then there's this whole question of like ecological domination that comes into it. I also wish I had time to get into, but I do not. But actually, the final thing that I'll say about this is a really key thing, is oftentimes people critique capitalism by saying that workers aren't paid for the full value of their labor, which isn't really true. In commodity exchange, it's always an equivalent exchange. 4 apples, if you trade this for 5 oranges, 4 apples really is worth 5 oranges. We've been in a situation that's been created where this really is true. So the labor power that you sell to the capitalist in exchange for a wage, so say $15 an hour minimum in Massachusetts, that labor power really is worth $15. But through consuming it, it creates a value greater than $15 per commodity per hour. And so this is the key of the insustainability of capitalism, is that labor power creates surplus value, but the wages that it's paid are always less than the total amount of surplus value in an economy. So if I have to keep reproducing my labor power myself, like I come back from work, I go to the store, spend my wages on this or that commodity in order to recharge my bodily and mental energy to go back to work the next day, across the whole economy, the working class can never make enough to fully restore their labor power, basically. It's a little bit more complicated than that, actually, but the idea is that the hoarding of wealth and the continuous production of surplus value and profit means that the working class never gets to a stable point. It's always this kind of struggle and back and forth, and this leads to all kinds of crises. So basically the conclusions of the critique of political economy is that capitalism is value reproducing value. So it's value employed for the production of greater values, employed for the production of greater values over and over and over again. And this is between firms in a market economy that don't necessarily need to be coordinated. Often, like in a free market situation, they're completely uncoordinated. But it doesn't matter how coordinated they are, there's still these kinds of laws of the market that emerge out of this sort of anarchic situation that compel owners of capital to obey them. You have to be increasing profit, increasing surplus value production at any point, or else you'll get bought out by somebody else that's increasing it faster and more efficiently than you are. The second one is that as the productive forces develop, as new technology is innovated that can create a larger mass of surplus value, the bourgeois social relations that are managing them and making this whole system, this whole relationship between capital and labor work, become increasingly unable to manage these huge productive forces they've conjured. I should have written it down, I just thought of this. There's a great quote, kind of funny, in the Communist Manifesto that's something like, the bourgeoisie is like a sorcerer that's unable to control the spells that they've conjured from the netherworld, or something like that. This kind of like mystical aspect of Marx sometimes. So capitalism is responsible for all of this industry, this extremely intense division of labor across the world, but in order to manage it, or bourgeois social relations aren't able to effectively manage it a lot of the time, and this leads to crisis. There are counter tendencies. There are things that the state often, or changes in how market economies operate, that sort of resist these tendencies often. But the basic math, the basic calculus of capitalist production shows that it tends towards more and more severe crises. Sometimes these crises, until now, every time these crises have been more or less recovered from. But it points to a situation in which they can't be at some point in the future, inevitably. And so that doesn't mean communism necessarily is inevitable. We'll get more into that later. But that crisis in capitalism is. And so the proletariat has a unique kind of historical role in the situation, in that it has the ability to not only abolish capitalism, but abolish all of class society. And so this kind of socialistic, communistic ideal has been present for a lot of human history, but it's only ever been an ideal until the development of capitalism, for a variety of reasons that we'll get into in a minute. So the proletariat can be thought of as the most revolutionary class in history, for a lot of reasons. So it holds a lot of social power. The first most obvious example is power to withhold labor. So strikes, especially general strikes, where an entire economy on a national, or hopefully hypothetically on an international level, all labor is withheld regardless of specific trade or industry, for an indefinite period of time. When all labor stops, nothing happens. This is fairly obvious, but this is the working class's proximity to these extremely massive, intense productive forces gives it this unique kind of role here that couldn't be coordinated as easily earlier in history. There's also this tendency for class affirmation. A thing that often isn't talked about by most Marxists, I think, is the proletariat's role in shaping capitalism, where if there isn't the capacity or conscious foresight to have a critique of political economy enough that one's experience as a worker, their suffering and misery and exploitation and whatnot, leads to an idea to completely abolish the wage system. Often it's things that we might expect, like campaigning for free healthcare, for higher wages, for better conditions, for better housing, whatever it might be. And so this is kind of a stopgap, or like a pressure valve almost, in the midst of crisis. So as capitalists are increasingly incentivized to lower wages, lower conditions and whatnot in order to increase surplus value, make the price of labor power go down so the ratio of surplus value is higher. In order for the proletariat to not completely starve and thus destroy the whole capital system that way, because there's no more labor, they organize into unions or other kinds of organized labor to protect themselves as the working class, affirming their place within capitalism, strengthening not only their ability to reproduce themselves and survive, but also strengthening the role of the working class in capitalism itself and maintaining the system as a whole. But imagine if all of this social power could be turned against the class system itself. This is kind of the central turning point here in Marxism. Is he says in Value, Price, and Profit, instead of a fair day's wage for a fair day's work, workers ought to inscribe on their banners the revolutionary watchword, abolition of the wages system. So all of the social power that's just been explained, if that could be somehow transformed and directed against class society itself, it's very possible. It would be a very possible task, because all of production depends on the people that are producing. And the role that the proletariat has had in structuring capitalism shows that they are capable of structuring the world. And so the way that change happens is also hotly contested. So sometimes people think that this just kind of happens automatically, that this crisis happens, and then people come to the conclusion that we can no longer go on living this way, and there's revolutionary action. Or some people think that there needs to be a party form, some kind of organization of communists that come in and spread a particular kind of revolutionary consciousness in order to shift it from affirmation to abolition. Sometimes it's the idea for this kind of cultural counter-hegemony, that people have this pro-capitalist consciousness that needs to be resisted culturally through some kind of cultural counter-institution to shift things. I don't want to get into a debate about the inner workings of all of those theories and the debates there. But suffice to say that there's a lot of different discussion about that for 150 years now, probably. So a point that definitely needs to be articulated is that the bourgeoisie also was, and maybe a little bit in very, very specific cases now, still is a revolutionary class. And it's based on advancing this kind of capitalist private property form against old feudal or some other kind of pre-capitalist property form, and championing discourses about individual rights, equality before the law, really some kind of political, social situation in which the free flow of trade, of commodities, and the sale of labor power, people being free to sell their labor power, but also freed from the land in which they can just live for themselves. That's kind of, all of that sort of revolutionary philosophy depends on the capitalist private property form. But the proletariat, despite all of this revolutionary potential, has no property form to defend. There's no new class society that the proletariat could possibly create, because there's no new property form that's been created on which that could depend. So there are some counter tendencies to this. There's the idea that workers have nothing to lose but their chains and a world to win. This is offset a little bit by things like the wages of whiteness. So this is a concept from W.B. Du Bois that white American working class people are constantly made to feel like this constructed racial identity has some kind of higher esteem, and then also economically they're given more of a stake in capitalism. The amount of private family home ownership is much higher among white Americans, as far as I know. Access to union bureaucracy, I think, would also be higher. Just general wealth. This also goes into gender categories and colonial categories, religious things in some parts of the world. There's all these counter tendencies to split up the proletariat and make some of them not only believe that they have a stake in maintaining capitalism, but actually some kind of economic relationship that makes it hard for them to come to this communist consciousness as easily. And so this all leads to the possibility of communism. All of the things that have been mentioned so far means that capitalism inevitably creates the conditions for communism to be possible. So I sort of mentioned this earlier, but a more expanded thing is it's not that we can all just sit around and wait for this inevitable apocalyptic heyday where all of a sudden all of class society is at stake and we can just kind of watch it bubble up out of the ground, this new communist society. There still has to be this kind of voluntaristic human action, some kind of shift in consciousness. How that happens specifically also is a hotly contested thing, but the conditions for it to be possible are inevitably produced. I believe that they were produced about 100 years ago, around the era of the Russian Revolution, and then the window sort of closed for a variety of reasons. I think that the current wave of class struggle, maybe beginning in the 70s and kind of getting to a new arc now, is possibly another window opening.
Let's go.
Yeah.
We love to open the window.
So now that I've explained a little bit more about communism, I'll say some things that it definitely isn't. State ownership in the transitionary phase possibly can play a very decisive role, but it really has nothing to do with state ownership, communist social relations. You can think about the American post office, for example. It's not for-profit, but even if it was for-profit, it's effectively the government managing production as though it's a firm. And so if we have a state that owns the means of production, it's been nationalized on the whole scale of the nation, it's effectively like the state has become a private firm that owns a country. And so even if this firm is completely democratically managed, even if it's extremely participatory kinds of democracy that are going into the organizing and administration of the state and thus of production, that ultimately means that the entire society has become the proletariat and the collective capitalist of the means of production that they are employed to. Another one is workplace democracy, also can be useful in the transitionary period, and just kind of generally organizing production in common is probably a true aspect of communism. But this on its own doesn't get over some of the logics of capitalism for the same reason. Collective management of individual firms in a market situation or any other situation, or I guess it kind of always would be a market situation. That's another thing. But it's still workers in a firm collectively constituting themselves as a capitalist, basically managing their firm as any individual capitalist would, for the reason that they are subjected to the same kind of laws of value that I articulated earlier. So competing with other businesses, meaning increasing the productive forces through technological innovation, through reorganizing how they labor, through laying people off, through reducing wages. All of these decisions would have to be come to democratically, if not by the will of a private individual or some kind of monopolistic group. So it's not even worker ownership. This is the thing that people usually try to agree on for what socialism or communism is the idea that the workers collectively own the means of production. So this is a quote, I should have cited it. It's from Louis Althusser's On the Reproduction of Capitalism in the section on the law. It is wrong to define the socialist revolution as the transition from one kind of ownership to another, from ownership of the means of production by individuals or monopolistic groups to a handful to ownership of the same means of production by the collectivity. That is, the state on the one hand and cooperatives on the other. For to talk about the collective ownership of the means of production is to talk about not socialist relations of production, but let us say socialist law, and to mistake so-called socialist law for socialist relations of production. If we stick to this purely legal definition of the socialist mode of production, we risk very, very serious delusions. So ownership describes access to specific objects, basically. It's the way that people's possessions or tools or means of subsistence is regulated and separated from other people's. So it's not simply the way that workers have access to production, but it's the nature of production itself, is that production not only becomes for use, but the concept of use value might not even be useful to describe communist production, specifically because there's no like productivist kind of logic within society that is trying to organize the production of a specific thing to the consumption from a specific other person in this kind of like central bureaucratic distribution mechanism that ultimately just resembles a market. There's this, some of you might have heard of the economic calculation problem, or socialist calculation debate, something like that. It was the turn of the 20th century. The idea of, okay, if we don't have a market economy, how do we coordinate production and distribution? All of the solutions to that are trying to supplant a market economy with some kind of artificial version of a market economy, artificial market signals, basically trying to ape a market economy without actually abolishing the central fundamental parts of why the production happens the way it does. So Marx's whole project, his critique of political economy and his communist politics, you might have noticed that there's very few things that he positively identifies as elements of communism, as like, this is the way that communism will work, or this is the way this will be organized. And that's because he is mostly interested in identifying what parts of capitalism have to be negated. That being said, an analogy that I often like to use is if Marx was looking at communism through a telescope, through this kind of historical telescope, and he sees a blurry picture, and he has to identify, okay, what kind of clouds are in front of it, how do we get past these clouds, and so on. If we're moving closer to the image through history, it becomes clearer as we move through it. So I think that there are more positive things that we can say about communism than we could in Marx's time. It's kind of a hypothesis. I don't know if that actually maybe works that way. But so you might have heard from each according to their ability, to each according to their need. I was going to talk about that earlier, but I missed it. This basically means that production becomes life's prime want, is another way that it's put, is that production of cars is no longer a thing that you go and clock into work for, and learning a new language is not something that you do purely for fun anymore. The ability to labor and to produce is no longer bifurcated into leisure time and production time, and kind of the ability, one's unique individual abilities to contribute to social labor is not coercively incentivized. There's people contribute what they're able to contribute, and then receive what they need from the collective kind of social pot. Some more things, Marx did stress internationalism, but I just want to kind of recapitulate that, is that as capitalism develops and the world economy becomes increasingly interconnected through like outsourcing labor and through moving financial capital around the world, is that workers across the world in various kinds of trades and industries and situations find themselves more and more bound up across national lines and other kinds of divisions of the possible divisions of the proletariat. And so this means international revolution. Now more than ever, increasingly, always increasingly, because of the expansion of the world economy, does revolution have to be conducted on an international basis. And so this doesn't mean that all of a sudden the entire working class across the world will simultaneously erupt into some sort of revolutionary force, but that revolutions in some locations cascade and affect possible revolutionary situations in other locations, and that only through the perpetual, permanent continuation of this process can socialism be established. But then communism itself isn't only international, it's post-national, just as the same way that the nation state is a historically specific construct used specifically for the development of capitalist industry. Communist production has to be based on some kind of post-national global community situation. So this isn't to say necessarily some kind of global human language or global human culture, but society organized on a much larger scale and probably on a more asymmetric scale as well. I have a kind of cyborg hodgepodge in the computer right now. And so 2 points I wanted to bring up from this short essay called 3 Agricultural Revolutions. 2 minimum conditions of communism. One has to be free access to the means of life, so free access to tools and means of subsistence wherever one might find themselves. The second point, which is kind of very much tied into the first, is freedom of movement around the world. So this might mean, so if we have only the first one, if we imagine some kind of possible local regime of domination somebody is setting up, which is also kind of hard to imagine because everybody has free access to all of the means of life, food, water, shelter, but also, play, intellectual activities, whatever it is. How could it be that somebody could set up a regime where these things become scarce if it's just if these things are produced to be shared by everybody? But if this were to happen, freedom of movement would ensure that anybody that finds themselves in a situation like this could travel to another community and have the same ability to meet their needs. So these are things that have been articulated in the last 10 years. John Clegg and Rob Lucas are very much alive and are middle-aged men as far as I know. The third point is deconstruction of a lot of categories that Marx and Engels and people after him might have just taken for granted, might have just assumed that these different races of humans of the world just sort of naturally exist and are organized this way just naturally. And that gender roles are equally natural and perceived from some kind of biological essence or something. And through a lot of Marxist feminist and queer Marxist theory and critiques of racial capitalism and white supremacy's role in capitalism, these categories have also been shown to be historically specific and produced as economic disparities and ideologies that ultimately serve to reinforce capitalism. So I mentioned earlier workers that are in settler colonial nations or are in heavily racialized nations might have more of a stake in maintaining the capitalist system than those that find themselves on the other side of those dichotomies. And so communism historically locates them and deconstructs them. And so we can kind of talk about communism as one that is genderless and possibly raceless. Not that people all of a sudden have the same ethnicity, or that the category of race is no longer intelligible, or can no longer intelligibly describe the culture and society that we find ourselves in. Another one that I believe is fairly present in Marx, but he has his own kind of back and forth about it, is emphasis on class self-abolition. So this is something I talked a little bit about earlier, but a lot of people imagine communism as this sort of global republic of labor, that the proletariat as a class becomes generalized to everybody. But this ultimately also means that being a collective capitalist would be generalized to everybody. It's become more and more apparent from struggles, especially since the riots in Paris in May 1968, that the class struggle is moving towards rejecting work entirely. It's less about what kind of better conditions or more democratic situations can we create at our workplace, what's a better way to manage production beyond capitalist social relations, and it's more about people just that don't want to work. They cannot go on working in this model of production. It's not about a better way of managing it, it's about ending the condition of the working class. And so, I'd like to open it up to you guys. What other kinds of things can you think of? What other kinds of things would you like to see in a possible communist world that I haven't mentioned? And this doesn't have to be based on some kind of rigorous analysis of the world economy. You can be a little bit utopian. I won't call you an idealist or something. Don't worry. But just if anybody has any ideas, I'd love to hear any kind of aspects of a future that you think would be interesting to see. Eli.
Cybernetics.
Yeah, I think self-regulating kinds of organizing systems are definitely would have a place and are maybe limited by current market forces. I think absolutely, yeah.
Or United World Government.
United World Government, yeah. Absolutely. I think, it's maybe just an issue of vernacular, but I think possibly an important part of communism is that there's no longer this division between government, those that govern and those that are governed, where there's this kind of civil society that exists on top of just social interactions. Like here we are, friends, fellow students, and that there's some kind of organizing entity above just the way that we relate to each other. Communism does away with that in the same way that it does away with the state. But it is true that there's global administration of at least some production, I think is absolutely true, yeah. Nick, yeah?
Now this is something I personally never quite understood. Something about the contradiction between city and countryside being eliminated.
Yeah, I love that one. It's one of the weirder ones. It's one of the ones that's way harder to imagine. As this was said even in the Communist Manifesto in 1848, is the at least eventual abolition of the distinction between town and country. And so Marx and Engels are saying that the idea that we have these urban centers where all kinds of specialized industrial production takes place, and then we have these rural areas that are relatively less developed and kind of feed the cities. The cities have a sort of like resource parasite relationship to the country. I think communism does away with this too. And that there's, I think they say like the technologization of agriculture and the agriculturalization of urban areas or something like that. But basically to say that food and other kinds of more rurally produced products are now also produced in more developed areas, and that less developed areas become more developed, but in a sort of distributed way. So you can imagine like, I don't know, small distributed cities rather than these huge industrial urban clusters. How exactly that happens, we'll see.
Oh, that's really interesting.
Yeah, it's a lot of, and also it plays into a lot of really interesting eco-Marxist, ecological theory stuff. Yeah, any others? I can also move on if people seem good. Gwen, yeah?
Libraries.
Say more, yeah, what about libraries?
Deliberalized libraries, particularly, that don't function to support liberal utopian ideals.
Interesting. So just speculating, how would you imagine libraries might be different in a post-capitalist society?
I think we can see things, I think we can see sort of things approaching that with sort of digital libraries, like Moscow.
Or the Marxist Internet Archive?
Exactly, like libraries that don't, that are organized individually and autonomously.
Maybe asymmetrically. Another buzzword to throw in there. All right, great thoughts, everyone. Awesome.
Woo!
So just some conclusions, just to recapitulate on some things. Communism is not an ideal imagined world, or at least not simply. I mean, here we are imagining it. And this, I think, has some kind of social use. I really do. I think maybe it's thrown out by people that, I think Marx made some very necessary critiques of utopian socialists. I think a lot of Marxists since then have thrown out utopian socialism in a way that denies its possible social usefulness. But anyway, communism isn't a policy or some kind of change in management from the few to the many. It's something that capitalist society is pregnant with, like I said earlier. Kind of a gross word, I know, but it's everywhere. is it's the conditions for its existence already are present. And so the social force that is generated by these conditions point towards a future where all of the kinds of structures of domination that exist on top of them have been cut away. And so if you just think about the scale and depth that this transformation entails, that there has been class society since the earliest development of agriculture. Of course, I should also historicize and localize this. Not everywhere, mostly like in a European thing. There have been plenty of non-European societies around the world that have practiced agriculture and levels of industry without class society. It's kind of a complicated history there. But since the beginning of this sort of class society, all of the changes that have happened over the course of thousands of years, it's only possible to undo them all and move beyond to some kind of other phase of human history since the advent of capitalism. And so whether or not it's actually possible, whether or not we'll actually get to some kind of communist situation, the idea that it's even possible is astronomically significant. That the world has been developed in such a way where you can have a global society where people can produce and labor according to their ability and receive back and fulfill their needs according to their needs. So I'll end with a video from somebody that I mentioned earlier, Louis Althusser. No, it's unavailable. Why is that?
Maybe you have to watch it on YouTube instead of having it in the
Oh,
slideshow.
you know what it probably is that it's connected to the projector. Oftentimes.
Oh, if you turn off like hardware acceleration, that worked for me on the laptop.
Do that.
It's in like browser settings.
Hold on. I'm gonna upload for a second.
Yeah.
We're very
If you
professional
copy the
around
link,
here.
you should be able to open it in like a new tab and just play it that way.
Yeah, I'm gonna do that. Let me make sure the audio's working too.
Hopefully everyone's enjoyed the lecture so far.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, everybody understanding everything? There'll be questions at the end if anybody took note of anything that they take issue with or want to have explained more or something. Almost done. One last thing here. Okay. Just gonna play for a second.
You stealing all my credit card info?
You know it.
Well,
I'm really
under
long-winded.
communism,
That's why I set up this whole lecture.
under communism, credit card info will be collectively owned.
Okay.
I know that's a bit
There
of
won't be
utopian
credit cards, but if
vision.
there were, they would, yes.
You're right.
Yeah, get over here, Eli. Oh?
Oh.
Oh, hey,
It's okay.
I just
We
walked
did it.
over here.
I hope the
and-
volume
Yep.
works.
just your presence,
Yep.
your magnetic field.
Hope it's not super loud or silent. It's coming through the computer. You don't really need to hear it. It's subtitles anyways. It doesn't matter.
Perché la parola autogestione è una parola che non ha finora può avere un contenuto, ma finora non ha nessun contenuto. Invece il comunismo esiste. L'autogestione non esiste, invece il comunismo esiste. Per esempio negli Stati Uniti, questa terrazza di Roma, in che senso il comunismo o modo di produzione dove non esistono né rapporti economici di sfruttamento, rapporti politici di dominio, di sottomissione, i rapporti ideologici di intimidazione o di pressione e di asservimento ideologico. Da noi non c'è, ci sono questi rapporti. Sì, in questo momento. Ci sono delle isole di comunismo dappertutto nel mondo, per esempio nella Chiesa. Per esempio in certi sindacati, anche in certe cellule del Partito Comunista. Da me abbiamo una cellula che è comunista. Vuol dire che il comunismo ha realizzato
All right. That's it. He's kind of fun to watch. He looks like a zombie a little bit. He's a very troubled man. About 5 months after this interview, in a psychotic break kind of rage, he strangled his wife to death.
Oh.
I should say. Which is often what people talk about whenever you bring up his name, which is a good thing to talk about. I think a lot of people that are just invested in his philosophy kind of want to say like, oh, you can just talk about his thought, it doesn't matter, but it's a good thing to bring up, I think. Any questions? Any general questions about anything that I said? Any comments you'd like to make? Any critiques you'd like to make of anything? I have plenty of critiques of things that I said that I don't really have time to get into. I could be several more hours.
How do you get rid of like, so you talk about like collective ownership of the means of production, like even if you integrate it like on a state scale that tries to, you know, kind of alleviate the antagonisms that create capitalist competition and the antagonisms between producer and consumer and all these things that kind of create the negative consequences or negative tendencies of markets. How then, if not through like a kind of some sort of large scale state plan, do you organize production in a way and class or I guess humanity's ownership of production and control of it in a way that doesn't replicate like a market?
That's the question. That's the question. At first, I want to say that just because it isn't state level central planning doesn't mean that it isn't very large scale central planning, at least for some things. Is that I think it makes sense, not necessarily for everything, especially because of ecological considerations and you know, just the energy production, like fossil fuel energy, kind of energy production. There's some constraints on that. I think there's going to have to be a lot more localization of some things, but definitely large-scale central just organization of production for many things, I think, still have to remain. So the main thing that, or the best way I think to describe it is production without productivism. So there's no kind of surplus generation logic, either of surplus value expressed through money or expressed through constantly trying to create a larger amount of more usable commodities, is that now production becomes subordinated to need. Is that now need precedes production, and instead of production being oriented towards these kind of not infinitesimal, exponentially growing targets, they can be way more slowed down and way more dependent on the abilities and individual capacities of people involved in it. And so some things that are worth pointing out is that this means we might not have 20 different kinds of soup to buy at the grocery store. We might have 1 or 2 kinds of locally produced large pots of soup to pull from, but we'll have soup every day. And we'll have a lot of free time to be doing things that we want to be doing with our lives instead of being coerced to go be producing goods and doing services that'll never affect us again. The kind of labor necessary to keep the basic level of the world running, taking out trash, cleaning toilets, making sure nuclear power plants don't explode. The socially necessary labor time that will go into that, I think, will be drastically reduced, even if it means that we have to sacrifice things to, you know, people's individual behaviors. Like, you know what? I think I don't want to go do anything today. I don't want to bake any goods. Maybe some days nobody wants to go to the bakery. Everybody has to eat other kinds of food. I personally feel like I'm willing to make those kinds of sacrifices if it means that my life can be lived the way that I want to live it, and our life can be lived the way that we want to live it, rather than to some kind of logic of productivism that's so far out of you know, our immediate existence. Does that answer your question? I hope that didn't go too off.
I think so, basically, yeah.
Nick, yeah?
This is maybe a little, I guess, winding. How do I put this? You said you don't necessarily believe communism is inevitable, something along those lines.
Mm-hmm.
Isn't that kind of against the historical materialist dogma?
I think, yes and no. It depends on what I mean by that. And what I mean is that if we think of communism as inevitable in the sense that now we don't have to do anything, is that this is, we can see into the future in some way and know that this will happen, and therefore, regardless of any kind of individual action, this will happen, and we can just let it play out. We get into a kind of problematic politics that are maybe my largest critiques of things like the Internationalist Communist Party, which is, we're getting a little bit into the weeds now, which a lot of their politics I really adhere to, among other groups, but they kind of have this expectation that we can just be the most communists and just have the most pure maximalist program. And even though we're so unpopular, and I'm sure most of the people in this room doesn't even know the group that I'm talking about.
The insane clown posse.
Yeah, it's the insane clown posse. No, it's not. That eventually the proletariat will be won over to our side because communism is inevitable, and so eventually our politics will prove themselves to be the only way forward. I think communism, well, like Althusser said, here it is in this room. Any of you could come up here and talk after me if you wanted to. I don't have any kind of political relationship of domination or economic relationship of exploitation. So, you know, in some sense, communism exists right now, and so here it is inevitable. But also that the conditions, the windows of possibility open and close for it, and whether or not the windows move through is maybe a matter of agency, maybe a matter of chance, but I think that it's vulgar materialism, mechanistic materialism, which are maybe some buzzwords that need explanation, to assume that this is just something that will just inevitably happen in a strict kind of dogmatic sense like that.
I see. So the distinction you're making is just it's inevitable in like the sense of like, if we act we can make it so, but not in the sense that, you know, oh, it's just gonna happen.
Yeah,
History
its
will just
possibility
end.
is inevitable.
All right, that makes more sense.
But it's realization we can't just leave up to the wind, I guess. Yeah.
You have to. What's the Mao quote? In order to learn the taste of the apple, you have to, bite into the apple. Something like that.
Other questions? Allie? Yeah.
Yeah, this is a little like, it's not entirely relevant to the like intro to communism as like a lecture topic, but it is about communism, which is that, what do you think the role of talking to people like our parents or like people from their generation, or just generally people who were sort of raised with like Red Scare, sort of like McCarthyist like legacy, like, because whenever I try to talk to my parents or any of my like older family members, it's really like pulling teeth. And I actually remember this summer, like I was talking to Betsy, my mom, for people who don't know, and I was telling her like, oh, I wish Weatherly was here because they put this a lot better than I do, but like we had like a 2-hour conversation about communism, and I could just see like she was really apprehensive because she was really raised in these very like what do you think the role of like approaching that kind of thing is for the struggle?
It's a really good question. I think part of the sort of communist program, according to Marx and Engels, that I happen to agree with, is the abolition of the family. So it basically means that the way our families are structured is connected to capitalist production. And in communism, we have different kinship systems, more fluid ones with less gender roles and so on. But that being said, I think it's a mistake that there aren't more Marxists answering your question. That working class, radical political organizations that are appealing to working families, I think is super important and super needed, and there's very, very little of it. None that I'm aware of. If anybody is aware of any, I'd love to hear about it, actually. I'm in a kind of weird position where I'm lucky enough that a lot of my family are the kind of working class people where they're like, yeah, Democrats and Republicans both seem terrible. Seems like there's no solution that can really happen unless we just burn it all down. I feel like a lot of people just kind of have this sort of unconscious position that just, there's no way out unless we just totally start over. I think that a lot of people believe, or at least it's on the level of like, Fox News and CNN are both terrible, everybody's lying to me, And so then the conclusion is, well, then maybe we have to develop our own kind of position, right? But I'm not really answering your question, just kind of talking about how it needs to be answered, I guess. I guess appeal to people that maybe are older than you in your life, appeal to them on the basis of the things about their life that they already talk about hating. Nobody likes going to work. Even if you love your job, you hate going to work, I think. If you can explain that in terms of capitalist production and how it doesn't have to be this way, for most of human history, it has been a very different way. And if you could maybe also explain how it's very useful for the people that stand to benefit the most from capitalists, to create a situation in which an alternative to capitalism is widely despised by the public. Wouldn't that be like a fairly logical, conclusion for them to kind of create? I think that's the thing that is fairly simple and easy to argue for, that I would, I'd throw out there. But I think it's a great question that deserves more attention than I can maybe give it.
It was interesting because my mom works at UPS, and over the summer when all the union stuff was happening, like I was really trying to kind of like, red pill, or not red pill, but like, you know what I mean, like in that concept of like.
We can take back red pill. We
Yeah,
can say red pill.
yeah. But,
Red is the color of the workers, it's fine.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Right.
But no, I felt like I actually did get through to her at least partially, and it did kind of get to the point of like, okay, like you very much agree with me that like your labor is exploited, and there's no way out of climate change except through abolition of capitalism. But I feel like a lot of people, my mom is 60, like a lot of people around her age, like they're like, but the violence, like we can't resist violently, like that's a really big like sticking point with them. It's like really hard to argue about like we need violent resistance.
I mean, it's different maybe for our generation, but people don't think often about the day-to-day violence that's needed for the maintenance of capitalism.
That's what I said to her. I was like, what about all
yeah.
like
It's a pretty straightforward argument to make, that the amount of people that die by starvation every day, and the people that are killed by police every day, all kinds of things that don't need to exist. We have more than enough resources for everybody, and the idea that we live in a world where people die because they can't get access to them, or are killed because they aren't participating in society in the way that's conducive to its maintenance, are killed, is a far larger kind of violence than any kind of revolution would be. I think there's some kind of like number time comparison quote somewhere where it's like a single day of revolution is less violent than a year of normal capitalism, from some theorist somewhere, something like that. So things like that I think are good.
Yeah, well, I feel invigorated. Maybe when I go home for Thanksgiving,
Yeah.
I'll try to wrap my mind some more.
Sure.
Yeah, change up the Thanksgiving Day, Democrat Republican argument. Drop the communism bomb on the table.
Yeah, do it. There's the quote, 1 millionth Marx quote today. Communists disdain to conceal their views.
That's
Is,
true.
I think so many people are like, yeah, I'm a communist, but I'm embarrassed with my family, so I always pretend to be a Bernie supporter or something. Is, be safe. Don't if it's a risky situation, of course, your safety is important, but as much as you can, just be an out-and-out communist is it's more powerful than you think, because people are like, whoa, what, you're a communist? You're just like talking about like pretending to be something else, you just are a communist, and then you can just engage on this really direct level that is pretty fruitful, I found.
Announce to your MAGA uncle that communism exists in this room.
Yeah, on this rooftop, yeah. Any other questions or comments or anything from anybody?
I missed the first half. I was curious how you're defining capitalism and also how you define markets.
Yeah, so capitalism, the simplest 3-word explanation is generalized commodity production. So production of goods or services that have some kind of subjective use, they're used in some way, consumed in some way, but they are produced specifically to be exchanged with the aim of producing surplus value. So producing commodities to exchange them to gain a larger amount of commodities or money as a universal equivalent, in order to be able to create larger surplus value This is generalized commodity production in that it's how production operates mostly across the whole economy and in a way that's superior to other forms of production, like say like a peasant commune or something. Could maybe still exist in a capitalist society, but it's subordinate to these higher logics. And then markets, I guess, would be the normal means of exchange and distribution in a generalized commodity production situation. Is that the means of selling and buying and consuming produced goods. And so this is kind of like an anarchic kind of organization. It's like firms aren't all coordinating about like how to set prices and how to produce what and whatnot. But from the way that the market compels businesses to operate, whether or not they are owned by an individual or like some kind of monopolistic group or the workers themselves or whatever, like they still kind of have to follow these logics of the market of always increasing surplus value production, always trying to create more technological innovation to create things more efficiently. And so even if it appears anarchically, these kind of laws of motion emerge out of markets. Does that any other kind of, does that answer your question well? Or
Yeah, I was just trying to understand what you were meaning by your terms. Actually, I would prefer different definitions, but that's a long tangent. Maybe we could talk sometime.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, I think they're fine terms. I had another question, but I'm forgetting. That was energy. I'm just curious how you see the future of energy.
Yeah. I think at least in the meantime, just a massive net reduction in the amount of like energy, like electrical energy kind of power that's used is definitely necessary so that we can figure out how to solve this whole fucking climate thing. Is I think any kind of ideas were like, oh, well, we can keep using the same amount of energy and just transition into solar panels or wind turbines or hydroelectric or even nuclear, is that the infrastructural shift that would require would maybe cost so much energy that it would offset any kind of benefit it would have if we just want to do that as quickly as possible. So I think in the short to medium term, way huge reduction in just net global energy usage. After production can be organized on some kind of communistic basis possibly, then we can talk about how to maybe develop things back up in sustainable ways. And I think also with this concern, it's important to maybe address that the abolition of class society and its ecological implications don't just mean like more sustainable things, but there's even maybe something to be said with the idea that human laborers are this distinct thing from the rest of nature. We have to manage it in a way that serves us, but then continues to serve nature only so that it can continue to serve us, is maybe going beyond that kind of binary is worth looking into. Yeah, I think that kind of sums it up in terms of energy. The other thing was kind of a tangent, I guess. Cool. Anything else? All right. All right. Thank you all for coming.
I got RSU stickers if people.
If anybody wants a sticker, if anybody wants to come to the weekly meetings, that'd be cool too.
Yeah, meetings are Fridays at 6 p.m.
Maybe not this Friday because we're going to be in Atlanta.
I mean, I could try to hold down the fort. Maybe not this Friday. I'll see how I am.
That was a really good.
I'm glad you all came.